for joining us today at the Women in Transport Conference in Africa. And today in this session, we are going to look at the research and evidence on walking and cycling for safety and security. This is an interesting conversation between myself in India and Abigail Mogai, who's based in Kenya. We will both share the research that we have conducted in our respective geographies around the travel behavior and patterns of walking and cycling in Nairobi and for me in East India. And then we will have a conversation on what are the similarities and differences between our contexts and how is it that we can move from research towards action. With this, I would like to invite Abigail, who is a transportation engineer at NMATA, and she's going to talk about her research on cycling in cities in Kenya.
Thank you, Sonam. Okay. My name is Abigail Mogai, and I'm a transportation engineer from Kenya, Nairobi, and I am currently working with the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, which is tasked with providing an integrated public transport system for the Nairobi Metropolitan Area that comprises of 5 counties. So we are still in the early stages of implementing BRT, integrated transport, because transportation is now a necessity for each and every one of us. And we're trying to provide an integrated public transport system now for the residents of the capital city. So thank you. And I'll start sharing my screen now for everyone. Let me start by expressing my delight and for being involved in this year's Women in Transportation Conference in Africa. It's a great honor to be here to discuss on the topic of research on walking and cycling, evidence for safety and security. Walking is the oldest mode of transport and the most dominant. This is supported by a study conducted by JICA, and we call it New Plan, and it shows that only 15% of the trips within Nairobi are conducted by private vehicles, and 80% of the trips are done by walking or public transport. So this shows that virtually everyone at one point is a pedestrian because we rely on walking for the last mile connectivity. Despite these figures, we see that the transportation infrastructure developments focus on motorized transport, providing infrastructure mostly for the private vehicles, which only comprises of 15% of the trips. This leads to numerous conflicts that endanger the non-motorized transport user, since they are forced to compete with the space with motorized transport on the provided infrastructure spilling on the carriageway. On the left, you can see an example of a photo taken in downtown Nairobi. We see that the majority of the users of that road are pedestrians, yet we have not provided any infrastructure for them. On the right, we have a very new road, we call it the Thika Road, superhighway, and at a certain point, entry into CBD, people choose to alight their vehicles so that they can connect now. Because of a lot of congestion, they prefer to walk, and we have not provided that infrastructure for them. As we continue to focus on motorized transport, what happens? People are encouraged to buy private vehicles. So we have a very huge increase in car ownership within Nairobi, as shown on this graph. We have a lot of impacts of motorization on our economy, on our roads, and within the transportation sector. First of all, is we have an increase in accidents. A study conducted by the National Transport and Safety Authority in Kenya showed that 65% of road fatalities countrywide in 2017 involved pedestrians. In 2019, we had 1,033 deaths compared to 882 pedestrian deaths lost in 2018. This is a 17% increase in fatalities on our roads involving pedestrians, and this has led to the categorization of pedestrians as vulnerable road users, and we will continue to have high fatality because we have an inadequate or non-existent non-motorized transport infrastructure. This is a recently constructed, it's now complete, and we still don't have NMT infrastructure. If we start from the top left and go clockwise in a way, we go to the right, then to the left, then to the bottom, we'll see that here we have a cyclist who's using the carriageway because he's not provided with any infrastructure. This accident occurred 2 months ago involving a motorized vehicle and a cyclist. Unfortunately, the cyclist lost his life in this accident. So you can see, if you compare these two photos, this is exactly the same spot where professionals expressed concern over the lack of non-motorized transport infrastructure. Another impact of increased motorization is congestion. Nairobi is categorized as the third most congested city in the world, costing the economy $1 billion USD annually. The average travel time within the city is 57 minutes. This has led to negative impact on personal productivity and economic growth due to an increase in man-hours spent in traffic. On the right, we have a photo of once when the city tried to implement a no-go policy for low-capacity public service vehicles. And the following day, what people did is everyone who had a vehicle on the road decided that on that day they're going to use their vehicle so as to commute from home to work and work to home. And this is a best scenario because it shows what will happen if each and every one of us owned a vehicle. This is the worst traffic we've ever experienced in Nairobi. So it shows that if we continue to plan our cities with focus on cars, then we should not expect any change. Congestion will continue to worsen. We also have an increase in pollution. Climate change and global warming are major emerging issues in today's world, attributed to the increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fuels. The transportation sector contributes to 27% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, making it the largest contributor to the emissions, the second largest contributor to the emissions. Another impact of motorization is urban sprawl. With people owning private vehicles, they decide to move further out of CBD where amenities are cheaper. People go there and we have uncontrolled development far away from their workplaces. And with that, you also have unilateral, like a unidirectional traffic. So you find that in the morning we have traffic towards CBD, in the evening we have traffic, people exiting CBD. So it's a never-ending cycle. Why should we encourage the use of non-motorized transport? Because in the words of Lewis Mumford, he said, adding highway lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. Case in point, our Thika Road in Nairobi. Right now, you will probably find traffic when you go there. And so governments need to take their approach in embracing the challenges faced within the urban transportation space. We need to have a paradigm shift where now we need to focus our designs on the majority in the model split. These are the pedestrians. We also need to provide for the cyclists, then for public transport, and lastly for the private vehicles. This is the only way we can achieve sustainable transport, since it will increase accessibility and mobility. The traditional approach of transport planning emphasized on a car-centered planning with large blocks of land with uniform use. Suburbs were common. The CBD were predominantly commercial. Roads were built for high speeds and limited accessibility. However, even right now with the pandemic in place, we are seeing that we have an increase in telecommuting, home entertainment, online shopping. And therefore, we need to focus and purpose our designs for movement of people and not cars, giving the majority in the urban setup the highest priority. We need to adopt the ASI strategy, which is avoid, shift, improve, which aims at promoting alternative mobility solutions that seek to achieve reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, reduction in energy consumption, less congestion, and more livable cities. Avoid emphasizes on improve the efficiency of transportation system so that we have like public transport and people are encouraged more to use the alternative modes of transport rather than the private vehicles that we see on the road. A shift, we need to move to more environmentally friendly modes such as cycling and walking. Improve, we need to improve the to energy efficient transport modes and vehicle technology. How do we do this? We need to embrace a few approaches, like for example, the land use planning. We need to control land use because it also controls the travel demand and also has environmental impact from the and controls the environmental impact from the transport system. We need to encourage TOD, which is mixed land use within urban centers, having both residential and commercial uses in close proximity of each other. This makes the urban centers compact and pedestrian oriented, encouraging cycling and walking. Another approach we need to embrace is the public transport planning approach, which focuses on measures that improve and encourage the use of public transport. The use of public transport helps retain employment and other economic activities in a central area, which is more efficient and it minimizes the impact of environment through reduced emissions and the amount of transport. Another approach that we need to embrace is the demand management. This entails management of demand more effectively on the existing transportation system by reducing the pressure on them rather than constructing new lanes. We can do this by charging motorists for use of the network, having staggered working office hours, exclusive bus lanes, and provision of NMT facilities. The urban transport plans do not rely only on any of the contrasting approaches described above, but proposals are developed incorporating each and one of them depending on the distinct characteristics of the urban centers, providing an ideal environment that promotes the use of public and non-motorized transport. For us to encourage people to use NMT, we have to ensure a few key things while we are designing for the infrastructure. We need to ensure that first and foremost that it's safe. Conflict points should be minimized and the geometric design should reduce the threat risk of the pedestrian or the cyclist. Coherence. The user should have the freedom of continual, easy to be consistent as well. Attractiveness. The NMT network should be integrated with other modes to ensure that the community's economic activity is supported. Directness. Desire lines need to be determined so as to place the pedestrian facilities where it is most convenient and direct for the pedestrian and minimizes delay. Comfort. The path should be clear of obstructions, minimizes steep gradients, and offers a smooth ride. What are the benefits of NMT? We have transportation benefits. Pedestrians and cyclists are more efficient users of limited road space compared to private vehicles. This helps in reducing traffic congestion, the most visible and major challenge in the transportation sector. We have health benefits, where NMT being an active mode, it involves physical activities and when done regularly, can produce immense benefits to the human body. They reduce the risk of lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease, depression, and other chronic diseases. Studies indicate that cycling for 30 minutes a day can reduce the chances of cardiovascular diseases by 50%. Environmental benefits. Being that NMT uses green energy, it reduces our energy consumption in the transportation sector, therefore decreasing carbon emissions. Economic benefits. The use of NMT is cost effective and significantly reduces the travel cost. Savings are derived from the fuel, vehicular maintenance, public transport fares, licensing, and registration fees. The Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative conducted a cost and benefit analysis, and it revealed that the economy loses 89 cents for every kilometer driven and gains 26 cents for every kilometer walked or cycled. This is because of the low cost of infrastructure construction, wear and tear, environmental benefits, low space requirement, and health benefits. So this is like a short or like a short version of all the benefits. If we increase the use of non-motorized transport, well, we have a decrease in accidents, congestion, air noise pollution, and we have an increase in health richness and economic sustainability. So I'll end my presentation off with this quote. A successful city is not a city where the poor have the possibility to ride cars, but where the rich can use public transport and non-motorized transport. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for providing an overview of how cities need to be designed for sustainable urban transport and especially the role of walking and cycling in our cities. I think as we continue forward, it would be great to hear what NAMATA is doing in Nairobi in order to promote NMT as well. So today I'm going to take the opportunity to pair with my panelists on sharing the work that the Urban Catalysts, an organization that I founded, has done in the east of India. And this is a study that we conducted over 16 months from May 2019 to about September this year. And the goal of this study was to look at a women's access and a mobility plan with the goal of improving their access to social and economic opportunities in one state in India called Bihar. Now, this state is predominantly rural, but about 10% or so of its population resides in urban areas. It also has the lowest female labor force participation in the country. And this kind of became the starting point for us to understand what is the role that urban mobility played in women's access to education and economic opportunities. We conducted mixed methods research. We looked at the transportation network in 3 cities, the population of which varied from 2 million to 500,000. And the transportation currently is predominantly non-motorized, so predominantly walking with informally provided public transport. And we also conducted a survey across the 3 cities in order to understand how was women's mobility similar or different to men, and were there any differences both by age and income as well as by gender. So we conducted about 2,000 surveys, and what did we find? And this is interesting because contrary to global literature, where we find that literature has said that women make more trips and more frequent trips, but shorter trips. In these 3 cities, we found that on average, women made 37% fewer trips than men. While we observed no differences in the travel distances for education trips, we found that women workers were traveling 45% shorter trips than men for work, right? Interestingly, when we also looked at the time spent on household work, female students spent twice the amount of time spent on household and care work compared to their male peers, whereas women workers spent four times the hours on household and care work as compared to men. And interestingly, again, what emerged as some of the differences in the travel behavior, we found that while 41% of all trips were for work purposes, women constituted only 18% of these trips, right? However, when we look at, for example, the purchases and household and care work, which constitute about 33% of all trips, we found that women constituted anywhere between 70 to 80% of these trips. What were the differences in terms of modes? We found that 39% of all trips were by walking and 21% by shared intermediate public transport and 27% by motorized two vehicles. However, the interesting thing again over here is that women constituted about 60% of all work trips. So even though they were traveling lesser than men, they were in absolute terms making 1.6 times the number of trips that men were as pedestrians. So, and this was an interesting insight for us because one of the clues it gave us is if we had to design streets for pedestrians, then we had to keep the gender of the pedestrian in our mind in order to ensure that the street was safe, secure, comfortable, and accessible. Similarly, close to about 60% of all intermediate public transport trips were made by women. And these two became really important. When we look at cycling, we saw that women made only 15% of all cycling trips, as well as when you look at two-wheelers, they made only 10% of all personal motor vehicle trips on two-wheelers. What were the reasons for foregoing opportunities due to transportation? While we see that what we observed is while the lack of availability of public transport and waiting time, we did not see a statistically significant difference between men and women. Safety emerged as a key issue. So again, to summarize, what were the key issues? One is that when we look at mobility plans, they do not provide us data disaggregated by sex, age, or income. And they also do not provide us data on the sexual harassment or the perception of safety or in unsafety. When we undercount walking trips, we are actually undercounting women's trips. The third piece was that traveling safely in the night also emerged as a major cause of concern due to deserted or secluded streets, street lighting, the fear of thefts, or groups of men standing at corners. And so what did we do? Our proposal made comprehensive recommendations across different modes of transport, looking at bus-based public transport, shared IPT, and non-motorized transport. And I'm going to share a section of the work that we did, which is creating street design guidelines that mainstreamed women's mobility and access. And so what were the key principles? Safety and security, universal accessibility, women's mobility and proximity of care, environmental sustainability, informal economy, behavior change, as well as efficiency of road space. And while we defined a hierarchy of street network in order to classify the non-motorized transport streets, the local streets, intermediate streets, and major streets, we also then created guidelines on what are the distances at which certain land uses needed to be integrated with transport. So a traditional definition of land use and transport integration is only limited to transit-oriented development around mass rapid transit stations. But in this case, we created guidelines in order to ensure that amenities that are used or accessed on a daily basis are located within 400 meters of residential areas, whereas those that can be accessed by 1.2 kilometers were some of the larger amenities, which looked at hospitals, for examples, and then those that could be accessed by public transport, which could be universities or larger attractors. And we went down to the detail of providing guidelines on how footpaths, how cycle tracks, etc. could be designed. I'm going to go through some of these very quickly. Some of these are part of street design guidelines in general, but our key contribution in these was to add the specific gender elements that can create safer streets for women and other vulnerable groups. So first was recommending footpaths that include three zones, that is the frontage zone, an uninterrupted walking zone, and a multi-utility zone that accommodates street vendors, seating, trees, etc., and that the width would differ based on the adjoining land use. Also looked at how we could ensure continuous and accessible and unobstructed footpaths. Many cities in India can get very hot in the summers, and thermal comfort makes a very big part of our street experience. Our recommendations on cycling included dedicated cycle tracks, as well as ensuring safe crossing at intersections, providing cycle parking, and also taking into consideration a number of aspects. One is considering, for example, how the cycle parking is located and that it is located in safe areas to enable women's access to cycles in urban areas through dedicated programs or schemes, and also including training or training programs for women and girls to learn bicycling, to repair and maintain bicycles, and in the design of the cycles as well. Of course, we made very precise recommendations on street lighting that focus not only on the carriageway, but also the footpath, and with a focus on reducing any dark corners or dead spaces. Our major recommendations came in the design of bus stops in order to ensure that they included not only transparent back panels for visibility, ensuring lighting, priority seating for caregivers, elderly, and for persons with disability. Where could the signage, for example, come in, which comes on the rightmost panel, space for street vendors, dustbins, as well as any additional seating that may also be required. Similarly, because all the three cities had a high proportion of intermediate public transport, we felt that we also needed to improve their waiting experience for intermediate public transport as well. However, because these services are frequent, and we therefore made a simple IPT stand that has an information panel and a shelter. So we hope that going forward, Indian cities will also take the example of the digital matatus, and we will have a map of the IPT routes in our cities, along with other information related to transit and transit stops. Street vendors are a very critical part of Indian cities, and we felt that it was important not only from a safety perspective for women, but also in providing affordable goods and services. And we presented some arguments of if you had one car parking space, that could actually accommodate or provide space for 4 livelihoods. And that space, which would earlier cater to only 3 persons per day, that same space could actually cater to 20 to 50% persons minimum on a daily basis, and also activate the area around. We defined guidelines for no vending areas and stated that except for these, all other spaces along our streets technically should permit vending. Compound walls are a very key aspect of safety and visibility. We defined different heights of compound walls depending on the adjacent land use. So going from porous walls to those that can have a higher degree of privacy. Recommending public toilets and nursing rooms. And we included these as part of our street design guidelines because we know that the presence of public toilets and nursing rooms makes a big difference for women's presence in public spaces and caregivers' presence as well. A key aspect that we also addressed is how is it that we avoid blind corners and dead spaces on our streets through very small and practical recommendations, be it through trimming of certain vegetation, CCTV cameras in areas that don't have high footfalls, having mirrors at corners that allow you to see if someone is approaching from a blind corner, and creating gender violence maps with women in a neighborhood in order to understand the safe and unsafe spaces. We also wanted to create guidelines for behavior change that could be part of any public signage that could convey a very strong approach to zero tolerance to sexual harassment, or what are the gender etiquettes that need to be maintained while traveling, as well as encouraging women to report sexual harassment, and also suggesting that we don't have advertisements that enforce gender stereotypes, but also kind of promote and are gender positive. We outlined the role of the police because we know that the police also has a big role to play in when we are talking about safety on our streets, and we included multiple recommendations, some of which are being implemented in Indian cities. For example, ensuring that we have frequent police patrols, not only in the day, but also in the night in order to ensure safer travel. Having volunteers at the community level who can work with the police in order to address any gender-based violence, considering the role of street vendors as street marshals because they are part of our public spaces, and could they be empowered in order to serve as street marshals as well. Very quickly, we felt that it was important to not only go down to the guidelines, but also what were the specific gender recommendations in the street design process, which included one, when we do a secondary data review, we look at organizations that are working towards women's safety in public spaces or collectives who are already working in that area. The activity mapping could actually count the number of people by sex at different times of the day to understand at what times of the day are women present or not present, at which spaces are they present, looking at when transportation counts, which also include counting pedestrians, and participatory assessments, which could range anything, which could range from a safety audit or a walking audit or an accessibility audit. There are multiple ways in which participatory assessments can be conducted to identify the issues and then create a concept plan, which would then be reviewed by experts as well as organizations who are working within the area, and both transportation organizations, organizations working with women and other vulnerable road users, unions and associations, and then ensuring that the final detailed design is actually reviewed by experts. Now, who are the experts we are talking about? Specifically ensuring that that there is consistency from the initial concept phase to the implementation and to the detailed design, that we have a gender and street design expert, a universal accessibility expert, and a landscape architect to review the designs, in addition to a core team. We recommended a street design cell within urban local bodies that would specifically focus on reimagining streets through the inverted pyramid that Abigail shared as well. And that this team be led by either an urban planner or better yet, an urban designer, so that they could get the perspective of streets as public spaces.
Thank you very much, Sonal Shah from the Urban Catalyst and Abigail Muigai from Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, NAMATA. And we have a few sentiments from Christopher Cost from the Africa Program Director, Institute for Transportation and Development. Now, before Christopher comes on, allow me to remind you that you can actually, as you're listening in, key in your questions in our chat box, and you can direct your questions to the panelists or to the session leads, because most of them are actually joined in live for these sessions, and then they'll be able to answer you. So remember to keep asking those questions on our chat box, and we will try as much as we can to have the panelists and the persons that are logged in for this particular sessions get back to you. So Christopher Cost from Africa Program Director, Institute of Transportation and Development Policy is up next. But in the meantime, let me take another comment, and this is from Amrita Gupta. And they say that, Amin, great to hear about your curriculum. I work at Azad Foundation, India, where we train resource-poor women to enter the transport industry and have a comprehensive training on self-defense, confidence building, and rights. Let me read that again. This is coming from Amrita Gupta. It says, great to hear about your curriculum. I work at Azad Foundation, India, where we train resource-poor women to enter the transport industry, and we have a comprehensive training on self-defense, confidence building, and rights. Thank you so much for your sentiments. We continue to encourage you to write to us, to write to the panelists, ask them the questions as you continue to follow the sessions. Kindly remember to ask them the question. They should be here joining us live to answer your questions, and together we find solutions. I'm told that the Christopher Cost presentation is ready. So allow me for the third time to introduce Christopher Cost from Africa Program Director, Institute for Transportation and Development Policy.
Hi everyone, it's great to be with you today. I'm Chris Cost from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, or ITDP, and we'll be talking today about interventions for safe walking and cycling. ITDP is a global not-for-profit NGO, and we work in cities around the world to develop sustainable mobility systems and policies. I'm based at our office here in Nairobi. So I want to start by talking about how people travel. If you look around the region, our cities are predominantly dependent on walking, public transport, cycling, and only a few trips on motorized modes. In Nairobi, we have about 13% of trips on private cars. In Mombasa, it's only 3%. And something I'd point out for our gathering today is that these mode splits differ a lot by gender. So we did some data collection in Kisumu and found that, men have much higher access to private vehicles, while you see a lot of walk trips for women. And even cycling, you can see there's a dramatic difference. A lot more men have access to cycles than women do. So it's important to keep these figures in mind as we look at how we're designing our cities. If you look at most of our streets, we have great space for private vehicles. We have a lot of space for parking. But when it comes to walking, cycling, social gathering spaces, or spaces for street vending, we do a pretty bad job. This is how we design a lot of our main roads. No facilities for walking. We design really awkward open drains that people have to climb over. We design streets without any refuge islands where people are crossing intersections, which makes it very hard for people to get around, especially caregivers like you see here. And our crossings are not safe. And so children don't have a safe journey to school. It's very hard for people to use the roads. And oftentimes when we design facilities for walking and cycling, the design standards are not up to par. And so we end up with results like this, with facilities that are completely unusable. So usually the answer is, why don't we just widen the roads? These lead to short-term benefits. They attract more vehicles. They only add to the problem. And they compete with public transport. And so they undermine a lot of the other goals that we're trying to accomplish in our cities. So how can we shift from planning our streets with a focus on cars to thinking of a more equitable approach where we consider all modes? It'll require that we really move away from this current mode of designing highways where we try to get the pedestrians and cyclists out of the way, up on footbridges, and really prioritize the fast vehicle movement by creating fences and other barriers for everyone else. Developing urban streets that acknowledge that there's a multitude of activities happening on our streets in African cities, and we need to have the facilities to support those uses. So having dedicated lanes for public transport, walking, and cycling. Here's a city that's been doing that. Dar es Salaam created the BRT corridors with wide walkways, continuous cycle tracks, and the priority for public transport in the median. And after all that's done, there are some lanes for private cars. Okay. So as we discuss walking and cycling today, it's important to recognize that there are several elements of the walking and cycling environment. It's more than just street design. We also need to think about building design, how buildings interact with the public realm, and network design. Is it easy for people to connect from one part of the city to another? So starting with streets have a huge impact on public health and safety. If we design unsafe streets, it's going to have very obvious results. Either people are going to walk less. When they try to walk, there's a huge risk of fatalities and injuries from the unsafe. If we design safer streets, that'll encourage more walking and we'll have better outcomes in the end. Here's how we can do it. Let's design high quality walkways. Let's get rid of the 1 meter, 1.2 meter walkways. Let's design wide walkways that provide a comfortable environment for everyone to use. This is a footpath in Addis Ababa in the university area. It has enough space for vending and other activities because the footpath was simply made wide enough to support the demand in that area. We also need to pay attention to intersection designs. This is just unacceptable, having this kind of design where there's zero consideration for pedestrians, for people with disabilities, and most of the users who need to access these streets on a daily basis. Let's start designing with universal access, with smooth ramps, with good finishing, without level differences. We need to set a higher standard for ourselves when we're designing streets. We also need to design for safety. And the key principle here is that as speeds increase, the risk of a crash being fatal is dramatically higher. Whereas if you keep speeds below 30 kilometers per hour, there's much less risk of that crash becoming fatal. Okay. Again, the typical response, let's just build a footbridge. But these footbridges are really unsafe. They're not accessible. They're dangerous. They don't provide a secure way for people to cross the street at night because of crime and the risk of harassment. And they often block the walkways. So this is just not a sustainable answer. And you might say, oh, well, this is just an exception. Usually these are designed properly, but no, it's like time and time again, we see the bridges blocking the walkways. People have to walk in the cycle track or in the carriageway. It's just not the right answer if we want to have accessible cities. So what's a better option? Let's build raised pedestrian crossings with ramps for vehicles. That helps slow down the vehicles. It improves accessibility because pedestrians remain at the level of footpath. Here's how it's been done in Dar es Salaam, where there are these tabletops at the BRT stations to provide safe access. It's happening in Kenya as well. Kisumu has good tabletop crossings as part of that city's first phase walking and cycling project. So this is something that can be done. It's already happening, but we really need to scale it up if we want to see this change in our cities. Then we get to cycling. Cycle tracks need to be need to be wide enough. They need to have clear width of at least 2 meters. They need to be physically separated from mixed traffic. They need to have a smooth surface material. And they need to have a good adjacent walkway so that everyone can walk in the footpath and not have to enter the cycle track. Now, a lot of the reason that we're not getting more women cycling in our cities is because we design our cycle tracks like this. That's not going to work if we want to expand the user base for clean modes of transport in our cities. We have to design the cycle tracks well, we have to maintain them, we have to clean them. We really have to show that we value this infrastructure and want to provide a dignified space to commute. Paver blocks are not a good material. We need to pay attention to the way that we construct these facilities, so using a smooth surface material like asphalt. Here's a good example from Ngong Road in Nairobi, where the footpath and the cycle track are designed pretty well with good finishing and good materials so that they're usable by all. We've seen a lot of action during the COVID-19 pandemic to implement cycle tracks, but this has been very slow in the Africa region. And so I'd really call on all of us to step up our efforts and really ensure that we're starting to transform our streets, not just waiting for big projects to come along. A lot of these protected bike lanes that you see here were done with basic materials, curbs, bollards, in order to roll out these facilities in a short amount of time and with a minimal budget. Street lighting is also critical. We have a lot of streets that look like this. This is from Aksum in northern Ethiopia, where it's a really dangerous walking environment at night. You really don't know whom you're going to encounter. We did some surveys and focus groups in Cairo, and what we found repeatedly was that this was a major concern. We were actually looking at the public transport and seeing how to improve access to public transport, and what people said is, it's just, in a lot of cases, it's not even safe for them to walk to the bus stop because there isn't publicly provided lighting. And in some cases, shop lights were helping to fill that gap, but we need to have proper street lights to make sure that people feel secure walking in our city. We also need to think about building design. So we have a lot of new buildings that look like this. They have compound walls, they have no interface with the street, and big walls, there's just no sense of interaction between the building and the street. And a lot of these buildings are lauded for their green building elements or other things that seem progressive, but when they had this kind of relationship with the city, they're not really doing their job. So we need to go for more of an environment like this. This is in downtown Mombasa, where the traditional built form does a much better job of providing these active edges and ensuring that there's that interface and that visual connectivity between the shop interiors and the street. And some cities have put this into their regulations. So a good example is Curitiba, where along the BRT corridors, the buildings are mandated to have active facades and arcades. And so that's created a much more welcoming environment in concert with the public transport that the city's been developing. And then network design, we have to move away from the car-oriented networks. A lot of our cities have very large blocks, poorly connected street networks. That increases walk time, and it doesn't give people many options. If a certain route is not secure, they don't have the option of going some other way to reach their destination. So we need to move to more people-oriented networks. In Nairobi and many other cities, we're seeing this proliferation of gated communities that result in a very choppy street network that doesn't provide good access to public transport. And it just results in this kind of enclave urbanism where we try to protect our private space but completely ignore what's happening in the public. So let's go for well-connected street networks with public streets, not behind gates, and make sure that the block sizes are no more than 100 meters on one side. So with that, let me conclude. We really have a choice. We can continue to build roads for cars. We're going to get all the attendant consequences, traffic jams, more pollution. Or we can shift our focus to building cities for people, focusing on public transport, safe walking and cycling, and create a better quality. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Christopher Cost. Christopher Cost is from Africa Program is the Director for Africa Program Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. We have Abigail who was one of the panelists in this session, joining us on a Zoom link. Abigail Muigai is from Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. Abigail, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for you, Abigail. Now, we have a lot of, we've had several roads being expanded in Nairobi, specifically to help ease traffic. But then you find that we have a lot of hawkers coming into the road, especially in the, what do you call them, the rush hour times. And they come in and are blocking the, literally filling the road. How best can we make sure that the roads are respected in that regard?
I think, thank you. The best way that we can incorporate our traders is by planning for them as well, providing like strategic also markets that are strategically placed, because you find that most of these people actually already have markets, but now they come closer to CBD where the people are. So we also need to make sure that as we are designing, as we are making the markets and all that, we incorporate transit-oriented development, whereby now we mix the two. We have the commercial use, we have the residential use, and we plan around the public transport system.
Okay.
So yeah,
thank you very much. Sonal is also joining us for this session, interventions for safe walking and cycling rather. Sonal, do you have any parting shots?
I think I'll also answer the question on street vending. I think we have a good example from South Africa itself. From South Africa, we have the Warwick Junction redesign, where the informal traders were actually part of the design solution, and therefore public space was redesigned and reorganized with them. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that engineers and road engineers often do not consider street vendors in the street design and do not provide adequate footpaths in order to incorporate them as well. I think that was my response to the question on street design. Yeah.
Do you have any parting shots?
I think I just have one parting shot, which is that the street design guidelines that we created looked at the larger street network as well as street elements from a gender perspective. And I would encourage all of us, cities, civil society organizations, to be very explicit and recognize that apart from a few aspects related to street lighting and otherwise, we also begin to collect the data, both age and by sex, in order to ensure that our streets are inclusive. So I think that would be my parting thought.
Thank you so much, Sonal. Abigail, if you can hear me, do you have any parting shot?
Yeah, my parting shot will be, yes, we need to move away from the car-oriented approach and start focusing on having a pedestrian-oriented design. That's the only way that we can begin to see change within our urban areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is Abigail Muigai from Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, NAMATA, and Sonal Shah from the Urban Catalyst. And earlier we had a presentation from Christopher Cost, Africa Program, the Director for Africa Program, Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. Thank you so much to the three of them for making this session very successful. The session was Intervention for Safe Walking and Cycling.